We're in without any musical preamble. Okay. That's all right. I'm going to take up from where we left off, where we are in the historical timeline is early the 1300s, the 12th century, etc. But what I wanted to highlight is kind of the three religions. Where we left off, I think the last image was a Moorish astrolabe. And to begin to talk about, even though this isn't a comparative religions class, it is ethnic studies. So the Abrahamic religions basically have their roots in Kemet, in Egypt. And those strongly influence our Western world, as Kemet did in different ways. So from the knowledge of anatomy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, science, politics, the law of their influence is still felt, even though in mainstream culture they talk about the Judeo-Christian heritage. We're writing our checks with Arabic numbers. So that part is kind of left out. We calculate using algebra, algorithm, so it's kind of like we talk about Judaism and Christianity, but don't talk about the Islamic influence. And so, again, since it's not comparative religion, I'm not deliberately leaving Judaism out, but because, since what happened not only at 9/11, but before that, there's a generic ignorance that I'm not going to intentionally try to remedy all of it, but also to try and put it in a context. So this particular iteration of this class, so I'm not going into depth, because comparative religions is another class in the department, but I will kind of do a surface scan of Islam because of its influence on Western civilization. So one of the things that I found online is this image, because I was doing a talk on what I refer to as justice chess. And the idea behind justice chess is you have to look at the historical roots of where the game that we call chess came from. And without going into that, but I'm just showing you this image here. Most people don't think of chess as being invented by people of color. But from the Indian roots of a game called Chaturanga, in which there's images of Krishna playing Radha in a game where you have 64 squares, but all they're playing with is 8-piece backline, which included elephant cavalry, a boatman, and a few other things, a few other pieces. And then trade with the Moors, basically, because there was a game called Al-Kirkat in Africa, which is basically like our form of checkers. The Moors basically took the back line, added a front line of pawns, foot soldiers. So the basic meme is, it's warfare. It's a simulation of warfare between nations. But it's so Chaturanga becomes Satranj, pronounced Shitranj, and this game was brought to the Iberian Peninsula in both Moorish conquests, so both 1070 BC and 711 to 1492. So they brought it with them. So this is like during the European Dark Ages, and this is the game that they basically taught. And then what happened for it to become chess is once the Visigoths reconquered the Iberian Peninsula, kicking the Moors out, they got rid of the Moorish vizier, replaced it with a bishop. The king started wearing a cross, and the queen, which was a minor player in Shatranj and in Chaturanga, became the most powerful piece, and this was in honor of Queen Isabella. And then the pieces became white and black. So you'll actually see somewhere in the literature where you'll have Moorish noblemen in the chess book of Alfonso X the Wise, so he's a Moorish ruler. And it's 1270, 1238, 1283 in Castile, which means it's under Moorish control. And this is still essentially the medieval time just coming out of the Dark Ages. In fact, there'll be a section on the midterm talking about, okay, distinguish between the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages, and so you can clearly see the kind of the demographic here. So I feel fairly confident in talking about, okay, this is a game that was basically invented by people of color, but social and cultural transfer changed the image and also the origin. Because, for example, I mentioned the boatmen. So when I took the meme chess and basically called it justice chess, taking, for example, the piece called The Boatman. So knowing the history, there was a piece called The Boatman in Chaturanga. And basically, if you're in a ship and you want to sail against the wind's blowing this way and you want to go this way, you essentially have to tack, is what it's called in sailing, right? Right? So, patterned opposition. How do you get against patterned opposition? You go sideways. This boatman becomes the bishop. That's why the bishop moves diagonally. Right? But there is no boatman in modern chess anymore. But the history of the move moved it. Right? The pawn is the only piece that can transform itself once it gets to the end. And it can transform itself into any piece except for obviously the king, any piece that's captured. Right? So this is the only piece that, so it's going along with the concept of the difference between slavery and mastery is any slave under the African Constitution could get the same education access of anyone in their tribe and then basically rise within the tribe and become either a ruler or a king or something like that. Slavery wasn't a permanent condition. So chess is matching this, that basically that cultural ethic within those particular societies, and particularly the African one before it got transferred into Europe. Yeah, Eddie.
Was Chaturanga from India?
Chaturanga's from India. Yeah.
So it starts in India.
It starts in India. That part. That part of it. So there's elephant cavalry. There's horse cavalry. There's foot soldiers. There's different. There's the boatmen. There's different pieces within it. And so when I basically talk about justice chess and saying, okay, what is your game board? Like if your game board was LCC and you want to do strategic change, who's the king, who's the queen, who are the knights, who are the pawns, et cetera, et cetera. If you're going to make change, how do you do that? You have to understand the oppositional strengths of those that are opposing you. So same thing with city government or a workplace or the national scene as well. So it's the strategic use instead of warfare. Basically the strategic use of knowledge to basically achieve a justice goal. And one of the things that chess teaches you is to think 5 moves ahead as a skill. Plus that algebraic notation where you're using numbers and letters. Just like we were saying, algebra means the mending, the broken stick in which equality is part of the driving force. What you do to this side, you got to do to that side. What you do above, you got to do below. Start at the hardest place, do the hardest thing first, and then you get the correct answer by moving through a process of self-development. So there's a quote from Malcolm X, from actually the Chinese culture that Malcolm X liked: "Mind sharpens mind like steel sharpens," it's actually stone sharpens steel, ancient Chinese proverb. And the Malcolm quote is, "Of all our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research." So I found this image on a site with Malcolm X quotes, and basically it's showing a Klansman with a knife and a young brother with his Glock, and basically, not that they're going to use it, but basically talking about who has the superior knowledge in an theoretically evenly matched game. So, as an example from a justice chess context, even though white moves first, because in the original rules of the game, either side could move first. Neither has a tactical advantage. But in warfare, whoever takes the initiative might have an advantage because they initiate something, and basically you're left playing a reactive game. If you make the correct moves in chess, black, even though it moves second, can strategically make the game a stalemate. And so that unless, basically every time then white makes a move to take an advantage, it can be neutralized, if you know the right moves in the right sequence to that, right? So that's not necessarily, I'm not reading into it, but that is a reality with chess.
So it's the idea that good defense could win.
Yeah, defense can win. Good defense can win, right? Among other things. So, the Moors in Spain. So this is from Poole's book. So Poole was a British historian who read Arabic, and he was talking about how within Western civilization, because this book was actually popular or is a staple within African American bookstores. So the truth is that the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, was an African, not an Arab conquest. Conquest of Spain and Portugal in the 8th century, i.e. the 700s, and later the greater part of Western Europe was orchestrated by the Arabs who conquered North Africa, but the actual conquest was carried out by African adherents of Islam. Now, understand that in the history of Islam, there is Islam before Muhammad. Muhammad was simply the last, shall we say, Rasul, which is basically the messenger of God. So Islam means to submit to the will of Allah. A Muslim is one who submits to the will of Allah. And the Quran, which was dictated by the Archangel Gabriel within that particular worldview, this is the same Archangel that told Mary she was pregnant with Jesus and saved Daniel in the lion's den. So again, one of the reasons I talk about the Abrahamic religions is that they all revere the prophet, rather, actually he is identified as a prophet, Abraham, the patriarch Abraham, but they all branch off in different directions. They're cousins, and they often have interestingly opposing views, which we'll see. But the Moors, so the Rock of Gibraltar is named for the Moor Tariq ibn Ziyad, a general. He assembled an army of 7,000 and ordered them conquered Spain in the name of Islam in 711. It was victorious, and the Africans renamed Mons Kalpa, which is that giant rock there, in compliment to their general Jebel Tariq, the Hill of Tariq, a name that was anglicized or Spanishized, if you will, into Gibraltar. This is Poole's opinion. The Moorish civilization enlightened Europe, brought it out of the Dark Ages to usher in the Renaissance period. They are capable of this because, one, the Moors never had a Dark Ages to come out of. Medieval medical texts with, for example, anatomy and courses of treatment were written by Moors based on some of the technology that was from Egypt. Like I was talking about the other day about the cesarean section, was referring to how Caesar was born, but the Greeks did not develop it. The Egyptians before them developed it. The roots of much of European culture can be traced to the Moors, whose civilization was not only artistic, scientific, and commercial, but also tolerant of other races, cultures, and religions, particularly those of the book. So while they talk about Musa, which is Moses, and Isa, which is Jesus, being also Rasuls before Muhammad, in their particular point of view, Muhammad is the last Rasul or messenger of God. So many of the Moors' cultural and intellectual influences are still in evidence today. For example, chess, mathematics being one of them. Guitars, libraries, aqueducts, gardens, none of which were present in Spain before the Moors conquered it. So, for example, an event, or actually a question that might show up on a midterm somewhere in your future, the city of Cordoba is the place which in 1000 AD and 1100 AD had the largest library on the planet, 1 million volumes. So technically, since it's in Spain, it's in Europe, but that was basically under Moorish influence, and that's why, for example, the so-called controversial Victory Mosque near Ground Zero from the Cordoba Institute, that's why the Imam named it that, because Cordoba itself was a model of intercultural understanding. So it's basically what he's trying to do is kind of like a cultural center like the YMCA, you know, not only a gym, but also a place where different cultures can learn from each other, basically in the wake of 9/11. Because one of the things that people don't necessarily understand with particularly Islamic civilization is, even though we're not in this particular time period yet, the first country to recognize the fledgling United States was Morocco. And so one of the, is Morocco, not France, not Britain, of course, and we just rebelled from them, but Morocco. And so I'm not sure if this is the reason that Thomas Jefferson had a Quran, but Thomas Jefferson had a Quran. And that's how the first, Muslim congressman or senator basically took his oath of office, did so swearing on Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Yeah.
I think also that connection helps to shut down the Barbary pirates who were raiding international shipping lanes.
Yes. Barbary pirates, probably, or corsairs, that's another name for them, So Moorish astronomers, as we've talked about before, named all the stars in what we call the Big Dipper, in case there's another item, for example, on the midterm near you. So the name for the constellation in Arabic is Al-Mizan, which is the scales. So there's big scales and little scales. And this is from our local restaurateur, Ibrahim Hamid. Al-Qaid, from which we get the English translation of Al-Qaeda. It's basically, spelled differently, the way we talk about it with the terrorist group. But Al-Qaid means the commander, the code, and the base of the fortress wall. So the commander we follow, the code we live by, and the base of the fortress wall that protects us. And algebra, of course, means the mending, named in part, this is also from Ibn Hamid, named in part for its developer Hassan ibn Jabr, and also the connection with mathematics and principles of spiritual harmony, which is, algebra is not simply a mathematical computation technology, it's also a spiritual discipline. for problem solving. So this section of a building, which does have writing on it, Yasin, by the wise Quran, surely you are among those sent on a straight path, a revelation of the mighty, the compassionate, that you might warn a people whose fathers were never warned, so they are heedless. This is Jerusalem, the so-called Dome of the Rock. Jerusalem, the city of peace. Never a more ironic title was there given to a place. Became known as the Al-Quds, the holy. Many of the prophet's companions traveled to worship at the blessed spot to which Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, was brought by night, and from which he ascended through the heavens to his Lord. According to the authenticated tradition of the Prophet, travel for the sake of worship is undertaken to only 3 mosques: the sacred mosque in Mecca, the Prophet's mosque in Medina, and the furthest mosque in Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock. In 685, in the Common Era, the Umayyad Caliph Abdul Malik ibn Marwan commenced work on the Dome of the Rock, essentially unchanged for more than 13 centuries. The Dome of the Rock remains one of the world's most beautiful and enduring architectural treasures. The Noble Rock, which is inside the dome, is the focus of the interior of the Dome of the Rock, situated directly under the dome and surrounded by highly ornate inner circular and outer octagonal arcades. The Noble Rock is where Muhammad stepped into the infinite. And the infinite, translated into Arabic, is Al-Aqsa. So another mosque in that space, Al-Aqsa. So another mosque on that site. Now, one of the difficulties of worship, of course, is that this is under Israeli control, which, the city of peace, has switched hands under various, shall we say, contentious occupations. Yeah, so one of the things in terms of just talking about the why, for example, in contemporary African Americans might embrace Islam, particularly with the activities of the Nation of Islam, is that as Frederick Douglass himself noted about the form of Christianity that Christ promoted and the form of Christianity that supported slavery, Islam within the Quran explicitly considers racism a sin, because you're basically deciding that one part of creation is better than another, or that when you were all created equal. Which doesn't necessarily mean that racism doesn't exist within Islam either, but at least scripturally, there's an explicit, it's expressly forbidden. So, to move from paganism to monotheism, so in Kemet, all the netters, or netters, if you want to spell it out, were considered to be aspects of one hidden universal intelligence, referred to by various names, and all the different gods and goddesses were basically considered to be aspects of one. In Kemet, this belief was referred to as Shetab Netter. the teaching about the secret, hidden, supreme being, which is in everything. Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti, she's probably well more known than he is, because you always see her represented in jewelry and art and all that kind of stuff. Propose the one God view against the will of the priesthood, who was committed obviously to polytheism, in particular, whether it's Ra or Osiris or Isis. So polytheism is referred to as paganism by the Abrahamics. So particularly with, for example, the patriarch Abraham, who started worship at the Kaaba, which was literally covered with, did I explain the difference between Allah and Allat? This may get me killed, but hey, gotta say it. So, the pronoun, or the article, that's what the part of speech it is. Al means the. So, the Kaaba was a center of worship for the moon goddess Allat, whose symbol was a crescent and star. Look familiar? Allah means the nothingness. Allat means the manifest. So there were written on the Kaaba 99 aspects of the goddess Allat. The patriarch, and she was worshipped at that place. And 99 names of Allat, 99 names and aspects of Allat. Abraham came along and said, okay, we're getting rid of this. We're going to basically talk about the one God, not a goddess. This is the patriarch Abraham. This is the beginning of patriarchy, something like 5,000 years ago. So what happened then is these 99 aspects of the goddess Allat became, in Islam, the wazifas, which is the 99 beautiful names of Allah. No mention of Allat. And you recall I might have said in earlier weeks, within African religions there is always a sacred feminine, explicit. But with the advent of patriarchy, that influence started getting erased. So within Judaism, for example, in Yeshua's time, there were 200 different sects of Judaism. And he basically said there were goddess worshippers, there were, Essenes and Pharisees and Sadducees and, Cousin John doing baptism. So 200 different sects within, the Temple of Solomon. And basically Yeshua synthesized a lot of those different influences into a particular message. So you had goddess worshippers within Judaism. You had a goddess within what became Islam. You had a sacred feminine within Christianity, where the Trinity was Mother, Father, and the child of true humanity. This is according to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And again, that influence has been erased too, because it's pagans who have goddesses instead of the one God, who is not necessarily explicit for gender, but is most often depicted as male. And right within Christianity, the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Where's Mom? How can you have a father and a son without a mother? Where did that come from, right? So, from pagan to monotheism, back to slide, thank you. So polytheism is referred to as paganism by the Abrahamics, but monotheism came out of polytheism. So for example, Shetal Neter, Shetal means secret, Neter means divinity, teaching of the secret, hidden, supreme being. So who are the Netarians? Yeshua was a Netarian, as is Osar Mesh, known as Moses. So Shemsu Neter means follower of Neter, or a person who follows the teachings of the secret, hidden, supreme being. So one example of this, well, another so-called pagan religion from the point of view, definitely most outspoken about this, is often Islam, who talks about, Hindus being pagan. This is why you have a lot of trouble between Hindus, Christians in India, between India and Pakistan. So Om was basically found from ancient Egyptian papyrus. So basically I'm showing you this in terms of looking at monotheism, polytheism. Some of these issues, these influences exist today. The whole idea in terms of yoga is part of the African philosophy of complementary opposites. Yoga had its roots in Egypt, where you have, in this particular image, you have Horus or Heru on the left and Set on the right. Basically, they're using a papyrus plant and a lotus plant to literally yoke the breath. Both of them have their feet on the lungs, and that long tube is the esophagus. So through control of the breath, you bring about a sema, that is a union of the higher and lower self. And this is depicted in a number of different ways. But the symbology, and this is part of my evidence for declaring that, for example, Yeshua was a Netarianism, is basically the references to breath within his language, and the coming from, for example, this influence. So in this particular thing, the aspirant who wants to overcome the vices needs to engender a movement towards virtue. This allows the personality to be purified, the lower nature is subdued, and then the true essential being, Heru, from which we get the English word hero, emerges shining bright to illuminate the individual and all who come in contact with him or her. And part of this union is accomplished through the breath. So, Set is an imaginary creature who is synonymous with the lower nature or the ego. Set is also considered evil because Set also murders Horus's father, Osiris, and then he has to be reassembled, remembered in a spiritual quest by Isis and their son, Hero, Horus. So Set becomes Satana, which in Yeshua's language, since he's Jewish, they don't believe in a devil, they don't believe in a hell. So Satana, which then basically is referencing to the ego, which can be put behind you using breath control. Get thee behind me, Satan, right? So while Satan has then been depicted as, the shape-shifting, horned goat, devil, trident, etc., 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 wasn't in the original teachings. And Satana doesn't mean devil. It means basically that, literally in Aramaic, that which distracts us from the unity. And since he doesn't believe in an evil archangel, that means your ego. And to fill yourself with Holy Spirit, which in his language is also synonymous with breath, is to put Satan in his place. Not in the foreground in front of you, but behind you, so that you can emerge. So just showing another way in terms of how polytheism influenced monotheism. So, where all this comes from then is there was no, where we're going with this is, there was no concept of a united Europe, though the Romans attempted to do that in their conquest. Our words empirical and imperial come from Rome. So empirical data is data that is accepted by the empire. Other data is not accepted. And so what kind of data is that? Well, you can count it, you can touch it, but emotional data is not data. Imperialism. You do what we say, or else, and pay us money, speak our language, but you can keep your own culture. And that was the Romans' basic MO. Just, render under Caesar. You have to speak Latin. You have to pay us in gold, but you can keep your own language and your own religion. Just pay us our money. This, of course, would lead to revolts, right? So, colonialism then, from Cristobal Colon, the actual name of Christopher Columbus. Colonialism basically, if you will, improved on imperialism by a total erasure of your native culture. And you pay us money. And also we need a certain ideology to keep you in line too. So, Imperial Rome moves from paganism to embracing Christianity and still falls, precipitating the Dark Ages. So, civilization continues in Africa, Asia, Turtle Island, the Americas. And the traditional canon implies, usually by omission, that because Europe was dark, everywhere else was too. There's no history before 1492. There's no democracy except Greco-Roman democracy of the elite. There's no civilization except for Western civilization. So the movement to unify Europe begins to form at the end of the Dark Ages, using a model of the Roman Empire and using a modified version of Christianity as the glue. So they begin to create a model in a number of different places, but starting ideologically before the end of the Dark Ages with the Council of Nicaea. So part of the history, as Malcolm pointed out, of how they get there. So I'm going to start. This is from Bruce Chilton's book, Rabbi Jesus. So Chilton is a Jesuit and wrote several books about, he says as a Jesuit, which is, the academic arm of the Catholic Church. In his introduction, he talks about how Catholicism has been responsible for promoting a lot of anti-Semitism, and that he didn't notice any great effort to talk about, Jesus was Jewish. And what does that mean? So this timeline came from his book. So from the birth of Yeshua begins essentially the Common Era, which we use the secularized term for the Common Era, or it used to be AD when I was in school, or BC, before Christ, and Anno Domini, after the year of our Lord. So from 2 to 16 in the Common Era, his birth and childhood in Nazareth. 16 and 21, his apprenticeship to his cousin, John the Baptist. And then John was killed, and Yeshua goes into hiding and returns to Nazareth at age 18. His excursions outward as a journeyman and rabbi, journeyman carpenter. His travels make him a major figure in Galilee by his 25th year. The city of Capernaum is his base as Pilate takes up his duties in Judea in 26. Herod Antipas's threat forces Yeshua to crisscross and skirt Galilean territory, gather his followers in Syria. So why there's a heavy influence in Syria and also within the Persian Empire. His last year in Jerusalem, age 30, and then after his death, the death of Stephen by stoning, the meeting of Paul with Peter and James. James is Esau's brother. Did I explain James's relationship to Yeshua yet? All right, so this is from Chilton's book, Rabbi Jesus. So he said one of the things you have to understand about him is he was a mamzer, which means Mary was pregnant with him at 13. Joseph was a widower, and he had kids. So in his village of Bethlehem, they knew that, well, first of all, the Jews of the time did not believe in the virgin birth thing. No, you got knocked up, and you ain't saying who the daddy is. And so that's why, for those of you who are Christian who are familiar with, the Bible, that's why all those begats in Luke and Matthew. Begat, begat, begat. Basically, they're tracing a line of succession, but they can't do it through Mary except through Mary's sister, Elizabeth. So that's who they're tracing the genetic line from, because they can't trace it from the father, because Mary ain't saying who the father is. So a mamzer is a person who is either born either because of incest or rape. And Jesus was mamzer. So that means he's not technically a Jew. Which means, it comes down to who's your daddy. So Joseph could adopt him, but that still didn't allow him to be able to go into the temple. So he apprentices with Joseph, who's a carpenter, but carpenter in those days meant that you also did stonework for building a house out of stone, the walls, and you had a thatched roof, and then you could be an actual carpenter in terms of doing woodworking for the door. Okay, so there was wood in the door, thatched roof, stone walls, and putting that all together made you a carpenter. And that was the apprenticeship, the journeyman, right? So Joseph dies when Yeshua is 18. And he can't go to the funeral because everybody knows he's a mamzer. So he leaves. And he disappears. And one of the places he is thought to have gone by Chilton and others is the big city, Jerusalem, where, of course, nobody knows he's a mamzer. So he can go into the temple and observe the debates, etc., etc. But essentially, he's illiterate because one of the places he learned to read and write is in Hebrew school. Okay, so he'd be illiterate in Hebrew because he wouldn't be allowed to go to Hebrew school, and if he did learn it, he would go late. So part of what Chilton talks about in terms of the synthesizing of the message, all the different sects of Judaism, whether it's goddess worshippers with the sacred feminine, or people like John the Baptist. So John is basically living the wilderness holy man life, wearing animal skins, eating locusts and wild honey, right, and dipping people in the Jordan River, which is, from their framework, Ruach is not only breath, the Holy Spirit, it's also living water, like the ocean, like river. The Jordan River is snow melt in the desert. So in order to cleanse your sins, baptism happens every day. Okay, because these are people living out on the land, living in relationship with nature, farming community, fishing community, storms, seasons, etc., etc. And your sin within that particular framework is basically being out of touch with your spiritual nature. So, baptism in living water cleanses you of your sin for that day. And you have to go back and do it the next day. Or every day as a daily practice, like John. So, baptism, as we think of it today, is a one-time occurrence either at birth or if you accept Christ later, right? But baptism in their time, just like baptism in their time, is basically a daily practice. So, he apprenticed with John the Baptist. That's why baptism became part of Christianity. There was also a sacred feminine that he integrated because Mary Magdalene was also a mamzer as well. So as a mamzer, he couldn't marry a Jew. He could marry another mamzer. And as a rabbi, since there is no tradition of celibacy within that religion, he would have to marry. And so basically that's who Mary Magdalene is within some sects of Christianity, where they believe not only did they marry, but they had kids. And Mary would be considered one of his spiritual successors. So hence, she's the one who basically talked about the Holy Trinity being Mother, Father, and the child of true humanity. So notice child is neutral for gender. But you need a sacred feminine and a sacred masculine, and those things combine to create a new person. This is the meaning behind being born again. Yes, to become as a child, that is a fully integrated human being. So part of the piece with this, later down in the slide, so the death of Stephen by stoning, and in AD 35, the meeting of Paul with Peter and James. The reason there's no gospel of Jesus, but there is Matthew, Mark, Luke, etc., is that he was illiterate, right? But brother James, who is his adopted brother, one of Joseph's kids, is literate, and he's responsible for writing down some of the early works. But notice, as is implied in Chilton's timeline, none of this stuff starts happening until after he's dead. Yeah, Eddie.
That's who James is. James is one of Joseph's...
Yeah, well, they're probably... Yeah, James is one of Joseph's sons, right? So he's kind of like Yeshua's adopted son, right? Because there's no biological relationship with him.
First cousin or whatever.
However, Joseph adopted him as a son, right? But there's no biological relationship. And so one of the key things is that, James is Joseph's son, therefore Jesus' adopted brother, and also literate, so he's able to write down some of the things that he's talking about, which
like brothers of the heart.
Yeah. So, the availability of the earliest sources of the gospel, basically James is one of the earliest sources of the gospel because he was around to write all that stuff down. Peter's instructions for apostles such as Paul and the Mishnah of Yeshua's teaching, known in the modern scholarship as Q, which is basically some of those things got into the Bible and some of them did not. The removal of Pilate in 37 and Caiaphas from power, the adoption and adaptation of Peter's gospel by James, the brother of Jesus, in Jerusalem in 40. In Antioch, outside of Palestine, followers of Yeshua for the first time are called Christian. So, notice there's no Christianity during his time. It's not till after his time. Paul writes his major letters, the letters of Galatians, Corinthians, and Romans. And then the death of James by stoning in Jerusalem. At the instigating of the high priest, this would be a high priest in Judaism. The death of Paul and Peter in Rome in 64. Burning of the temple, that's Solomon's temple, by Roman troops under Titus. composition of Mark's gospel in Rome, the end of the revolt against Rome and Palestine. So, for example, movements within Judaism like the Zealots, which is why we get that word. Basically, they're military guerrillas, or we might use the term terrorists. So, under Yeshua's time, there had been 5 separate conquests by different types of rulers, the latest being the Romans. And so people were resisting that. Josephus, the Roman scholar, publishes his Jewish War. Then composition of Matthew's Gospel in Damascus, Syria. Composition of Luke's Gospel in Antioch. Josephus publishes his Antiquities of the Jews. And then composition of John's Gospel in Ephesus. So Chilton's datings within his book, because the Jesuits tend to be, using that empirical evidence kind of thing, basically fall in with discussions. They're estimates, essentially. Ancient chronologies, dated events by the reigns of rulers. Calendars really don't even agree on when the new year starts, because different people have different frameworks for when that is. Ancient historians considered figures like John the Baptist and Jesus marginal, at least the historians of the time. Great, the Romans executed thousands of people. Why is this guy any more important? Right? So in this time, basically those Gospels are going to get composed perhaps in Aramaic, but the only versions that we have are basically Latin, Hebrew, and this is even before the compilation of the Peshitta, which is his words in the Bible in Aramaic, which won't happen for another 300 years. So, in terms of liberation, the idea of liberation theology, and basically to look at this in a context within the African American experience, if the King James Version of the Bible is the only Bible that we were allowed to have within slavery, there still had to be a way of interpreting it through the Midrashic, that is, the personal interpretation of Scripture, in terms of that philosophical practice, where you can basically say that Jesus wants you to be free, and so there's a difference between salvation theology and liberation theology. So part of liberation theology, as articulated within the African American experience, which in terms of writing starts in the early 19th century, or say 1830s. There are 2 faces of Christ in African liberation theology. So the idea of he's Black African, and that if you're going to study his words, study only, for example, my grandfather gave me the red letter Bible. So the words of Jesus, actual words of Jesus, are highlighted in red. Basically, pay attention to those, ignore Paul. If Jesus said it, great. Paul was a murderer. Jesus didn't kill anybody. Paul also says, you need to be a good slave and obey Massa. No, we ain't doing that. Jesus wants you to be free. So, liberation theology. You need human liberation in this lifetime, not salvation in some sweet by and by like Massa says. Okay? Salvation's not liberation. It's conforming to a system of control for the purposes of a human power hierarchy whose fruits demonstrate they don't have our best interests. By their fruit shall ye know them. So, would you rather be free or saved? That's the essential question. So liberation theology also says you need to go to the source, read the original, read the stuff that was taken out and that they don't want you to know about. For example, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Thomas, all the things that are so-called apocryphal, or the Gnostic Gospels, all the things that were edited out of the Bible that could be included. There's also, have a book that might be in your book list that talks about the other Bible, which talks about Adam and Eve's, like we talked about last week, Adam's first wife, another item that may appear on a midterm in your near future, that Adam and Eve had 5 kids. And that the 5 kids were Cain and Abel, twin girls, and Seth. And the actual reason within this particular framework that Cain killed Abel was not because of his offerings, but because he was in love with one of the sister that loved Abel, and so killing Abel gives him a clear shot at the sister. Now I can see, they would edit that out. That would make sense. And so all of a sudden, yeah, Adam and Eve get kicked out. They have 2 kids, and then there's a bunch of other folks. That always kind of bugged me in Sunday school. That there's clearly an edit job going on. So anyway, liberation theology. Discover your personal, unmediated relationship with the divine. Yeshua said you were already part of it. Separation is an illusion of Satana, that is the ego. And salvation theology says, what you have in your hand is the whole gospel truth. Don't question it. Anyone who does question it is in league with, well, you know who they're in league with. So that image, the image of Yeshua becomes a critical issue. So in a world without racism as we know it, the image is depicted without prejudice in Ethiopia, which as a country has practiced Christianity the longest in the world. And their image of Christ is as a brown-skinned, curly-headed man. So until the creation of a united, quote-unquote, Europe, this was the historically held image. And not until the Renaissance and Michelangelo's uncle, because essentially that's who is the model for Christ on the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's uncle, did the image change, and only then in Europe, in some places, and where also colonization began. So last week when I showed you pictures of the Black Madonna and pictures of the Black Madonna in places like Spain and Russia, some of the priests may say, oh, well, her skin is black because of the candles. Really? Candles? No. She's black. So just go with that. So Ethiopian Christ in the 1700s, raising Lazarus from the dead. Peter denies Christ 3 times, and the cock crows again. Ethiopian. So, Council of Nicaea. Council of Nicaea took place in 325 by the order of the Roman Empire Caesar Flavius Constantine. Nicaea was located in Asia Minor, east of Constantinople, known as Istanbul today. At that council, Emperor Constantine presided over a group of church bishops and leaders with the purpose of defining the true God for all of Christianity and eliminating all the confusion, controversy, and contention within Christ's church. Now this is quotes because who is contending and who's arguing about what? So if you're going to create an empire, what you need is essentially what's going on, for example, naturally, is in Judaism, where Christianity came directly out of, if you have 200 different sects plus, you are also going to have that same kind of division and doctrinal division going forward, where you have a presbyter, which is a particular focus. You have, I'm talking about today, Catholics, Protestants, Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans. Okay, you still have that same kind of tendency to divide and have into different sects and belief systems within that. So Constantine is essentially trying to filter all that down into one consistent message to begin to build an empire. Rebuild an empire, because at this point the Roman Empire still exists, but they're realizing we can't just hold all this together with military force. We also have to have a consistent ideology to build an empire on. Right? So, the Council of Nicaea affirmed the deity of Jesus Christ and established an official definition of the Trinity, the deity of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, under one Godhead, in three co-equal and co-eternal persons. So notice there's no sacred feminine, as in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. They're making a decision here, and it's not just simply random doctrine. It has an implication. Constantine, a converted Christian, and you could debate that, because how many armies did Jesus have and how many people did Jesus kill? What does being a Christian mean in that framework? Called the council to resolve escalating quarrels and controversy concerning theological issues. The failing Roman Empire, now under Constantine's rule, could not withstand the division caused by years of arguing over doctrinal differences. So not only is a threat to Christianity, but a threat to society as Romans defined it then. So at the council, he demanded that the Christians settle their internal disagreements and become Christ-like agents who could bring new life to a troubled, beaten-down empire. The main issue had always been, who is the Christ? Is he more divine than human or more human than divine? Was he created, made, or begotten? Being the Son of God, is he co-equal or co-eternal with Father God, right? Or less or lower in status than the Father? Is the Father the one and only true God, or is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit the one true God? I mean, all these different issues which, in the original version, there's room for interpretation and nobody's tripping necessarily. But to narrow it down then, ultimately forms a policy about what you're going to do with people who disagree with you or not. And if I were going to, so at this point, there's no racism as we know it today. So the church, when he's talking about Christianity, he's also talking about the African church and the church in China. And the Africans and the Chinese churches are basically saying, look, he was a master teacher. And yeah, he was divine, but he's also saying, so are you. So we're not really down with you saying that he's a representative of God, because we're representatives of God too, and so are you. So if you're trying to cement political power, no. He's a master teacher. And yeah, he's divine, but so are we. But you see, Constantine wasn't down with that. So we don't hear about the African sides of the church or the Asian church sides of the church, unless they conform to certain values that the Western side, the Roman side, is talking about. So the Nicene Creed, under the Nicene Council of Nicaea, Constantine demanded that the 300 bishops make a decide by majority vote defining who Jesus is. Oh, okay. Majority rules, huh? Whether that's reality or not. Commanded them to create a creed that all Christianity would follow and obey, and enforced, upheld by the church and enforced by the emperor. So clearly we're talking political power and reinforcing that. Yeah?
So the council really was just a justification of a system which served their agenda.
Pretty much. It's not about a spiritual reality. So this is why, for example, somebody like Naim Akbar, the African-American psychologist, said, look, there's a difference between spirituality and religion. Spirituality is an individually experienced, lived connection to something greater than yourself. So if you have a spiritual figure like a Jesus or Muhammad, they have this experience, which they might talk about, and Yeshua would talk about certain things in parables. Because being illiterate, that's all he could do, is basically talk in stories and use examples. And Muhammad also was illiterate. So, again, talk in parables. But there'd be lots of parables and lots of different ways of interpreting those things. So you need some kind of uniformity if you're going to run an empire. And so that's the difference between spirituality and religion. So religion becomes narrowing the spiritual experience down so that it can be replicable and consistent with certain goals. Not necessarily reflecting the actual diversity within humanity. So, the council meets, creates the creed for the Western Church. Rome still falls, but essentially then creates the meme around which to coalesce Western civilization. So, in other words, not Yeshua's Christianity, but Jesus' Christianity, complete with Christian soldiers. Because Yeshua didn't lead armies. In fact, he was being persecuted by the Romans. May get a cross burn for this, but so the Romans kill Jesus, then essentially take over his religion and convert it to a weapon. This is what I mean by weaponized Christianity. Because basically is not, we're going to basically improve you pagans by converting you by the sword or the rifle or whatever we're converting you with. Yeah, Obama shouldn't have used the Crusades. That's like dated. Use the cavalry. Much more solid ground there. So, the roots of American-style racism. So, part of that comes out of this. Again, since racism as we know it didn't exist in Nicaea. Right? They're basically just trying to put together the basis for an empire. So the earliest writings that I found so far is like the Spanish Inquisition. So Rome falls. That issue, it basically initiates the so-called Dark Ages, which the dictionary basically says goes from 476 to about 1000, and then somewhere in there the Middle Ages starting at around, then they'll say the Middle Ages start from 1000 to the 1400s. Anyway. The earliest writings that support the roots of American-style racism, that is the doctrine of racial supremacy, is about 700 years old. So in the Spanish Inquisition, basically suspecting people of Moorish and Jewish blood, that's literally a quote, and blood also basically was applied to black Catholics. So part of the Inquisition was not the attacks on Muslims and Jews who, the so-called conversos, it was also against black Catholics. So they were suspected because they were black. And they had Moorish and Jewish blood. And that the true Christians, and this is at the beginning of the time where Christian became synonymous with white skin, because Jesus was white. So, the name for the Spanish Inquisition in Spanish, and they're very clear about what they're doing. Limpieza de la raza, which if you are familiar with Spanish, means the purification of the race. So they're very intentional about what they're doing. It's ethnic cleansing. Not the only time this happens in history, but definitely part of Western civilization, because this is basically happening after the Moorish conquest of Spain, and the Moors are being pushed out, and so the Visigoths have come back into power, and they're exerting that power. So, the idea then, that meme resurfacing, a united Europe bound together by Western, Romanized, male-dominant patriarchal Christianity based on Latin, Hebrew, and Greek text. Edited Latin, Hebrew, and Greek text. So for example, last week when I was talking about Lilith, right? If you've never heard that Adam's first wife was named Lilith and what is attributed to her, and then her depiction in Renaissance art as the snake with a woman's head giving Eve the apple. So a woman who considers herself equal to a man, that's evil. It's the devil. Okay, which is clearly not Yeshua's message and clearly not in early Christianity. But he definitely is a part and parcel of this particular Western version. So, whatever egalitarian or sacred feminine influence from the original African or Aramaic text, basically all that stuff was excised to form this basic meme. So, biblical figures then were depicted as European, and the African roots and references were excised. Certainly in the first printed Bible, which the printing press was going to be invented then, so the Gutenberg Bible was going to be formed, and later what we know as the King James Version of the Bible was going to be created in another 100, 200 years. So, historical accuracy sidebar. So, Dark Ages, for your edification and your assistance with the midterm. Dark Ages from, this is the American Heritage Dictionary, period from AD 476 to about the year 1000. The entire period from the end of classical civilization to the revival of learning in the West, the Middle Ages. Now, okay, it is the American Heritage Dictionary that's saying this, so let's take them at their word that America is Western civilization. So would you presume from that definition that there is learning anywhere else? And the Crusades, to put that in context, from 1095 to the 1400s. And then the Middle Ages, also known as medieval, at least from the European context. Period in European history between antiquity and the Renaissance, often dated from AD 46, Dark Ages, to 1453. All right, so the Crusades, normally I don't like using Wikipedia as a reference, as I prefer you not use it in your papers, except to use a common definition if we can't find one in a paper dictionary. The Crusades essentially were a series of military campaigns of a religious character waged by much of Christian Europe against external and internal opponents. They were fought mainly against Muslims, though there were campaigns also directed against pagan Slavs. So note that word pagan, right? Non-Christian, either goddess-worshipping or polytheistic Slavs, Jews, Russian and Greek Orthodox Christians. So wait, Christians against Christians? Mongols, who were basically Asians. Cathars, Hussites, Waldensians, Old Prussians, and political enemies of the popes. So this isn't necessarily just a religious war, it's also a political one to exercise control. Crusaders took vows and were granted an indulgence for past sins, which means do whatever, you're forgiven. God forgives you. Originally, they had the goal of recapturing Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim rule, and were launched in response to a call from the Eastern Orthodox Byzantine Empire for help against the expansion of the Muslim Seljuk Turks into Anatolia. Anatolia is Spain, Portugal. The term is also used to describe contemporaneous and subsequent campaigns conducted through the 16th century, 1500s, territories outside the Levant, that is the Middle East, usually against pagans, heretics, and peoples under the ban of excommunication for a mixture of religious, economic, and political reasons. So not just converting people, but acquiring territory. So far-reaching political, economic, and social impacts because of the ongoing conflicts, people being people, people going to resist the Nicene Creed and other subsequent doctrines. So the president basically talking about trying to make a comparison about religious extremism, about basically what's going to be a hotbed. This is complicated. It is going to be complicated. You're basically on clearer ground, cleaner ground, just talking about the United States rather than the Crusades. So, the civilization, whatever the definition of civilization is, from this point of view, the Western point of view, the definition of what constitutes civilization is the ability to project military force. Are there any civilizations that don't have armies or warriors? We don't hear about them. So, the Crusades are the first projection of military force by a united Europe, even though it's not entirely united, against the Muslim world, among others. And of course, as I mentioned, some crusades were against fellow Christians. So technically, Muslims started it when they attacked Christian pilgrims coming to Jerusalem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They stopped because of loss of income. Wait, we need the tourist dollars. But of course, the damage was done, the insult was given, so this is part of the support of, well, the Muslims started it. Oh, is Obama a Muslim? Okay, well. So, I think, pagan. From my onboard Microsoft Word dictionary, pagan. Someone who do not follows one of the world's main religions. Main? Especially someone who is not a Christian, Muslim, or Jew, and whose religion is regarded as questionable, sometimes considered offensive. So, this definition, what about Buddhists? What about Hindus? What about, what's a main religion? How big do you have to be a main religion? Oh, they mean Western. A follower of an ancient, polytheistic, or pantheistic religion. Someone who has no religion, believing in or relating to a religion that is not one of the world's main religion and is regarded as questionable, believing in or relating to an ancient, polytheistic, or pantheistic religion, and having no religion. So, deconstructing that. So, like the ancient Greeks, ancient Romans, the ancient nation of Israel, ancient Egyptians, ancient Babylonians, actually ancient everybody. And then current Hindu, current Buddhist, current Wiccan, current Ifa, Vodun, Santeria, all those are considered pagan and somehow not modern. Also, for example, Native American spirituality. So when we start looking at policy, so it was illegal for Native Americans to practice their spirituality before 1978. Because, well, for example, if the Pentagon is built on a native sacred site, if the Black Hills and Mount Rushmore were a native sacred site, Stone Mountain in Georgia, native sacred site, how is carving images, in the case of Stone Mountain and Mount Rushmore, how is carving images of white men an improvement over the natural formation of the mountain? So, the implication being that if you do not practice the Abrahamic religion, you do not have a religion. And having a religion is seen as a mark of civilization. So this is also another piece that goes along with the influence from Nicaea, the Crusades, etc., the basic meme of, okay, Western civilization is the civilization for humanity. Yeah, Eddie.
Civilization as defined by who?
Right.
Well, tell me the table.
Yeah, well, who? Yeah, the ability to, well, have an army, Christian soldiers, etc., the true faith, all that. So the responsibility of the civilized is to bring civilization, in other words, real monotheistic Abrahamic religion, to the non-religious. So actually this meme is not simply just Christian, but definitely Christians and Islam, certainly with ISIS. ISIS isn't the first example of this, but as my grandma would say, the pot can't call the kettle black in terms of terrorism and religious fanaticism. So, as I mentioned before, the Black Madonna, worshipped throughout all Europe. So the many languages of Christianity: Aramaic, the Peshitta hieroglyphic from Egypt, then Demotic and Coptic to Greek, Amharic and Coptic Ethiopia, Latin, Roman Catholic. Catholic is a word which means universal. German, Italian, French, English, Gutenberg Bible, KJV, which is in archaic English, then Revised Standard Version, modern English. So lots of diversity within Christianity, and each one of those languages naturally reflects a different worldview and a political, theological, and other possibilities in terms of what happens in terms of policy with those who are different than you. Spanish Inquisition from 1478 to 1834. Now, part of the foundations of what I'll call Western civilization, and part of our American jurisprudence is in a reaction to what you're about to see here. So the Inquisitions were used during the decline of the Roman Empire until the Spanish Inquisition's decline in the early 1800s. So an Inquisition can be run by both civil and church authorities in order to root out non-believers from a nation or religion. And the Spanish Inquisition was basically, in terms of the body count, one of the most deadly in history. It was used for both political and religious reasons. So this is part of why we're so fanatical, or we give so much lip service in the United States to separation from church and state, was because of this specific example. Dangerous things happen when the state is God. Okay, Spain is a nation state that was born out of a religious struggle between numerous different belief systems, including Catholicism, Islam, Protestantism, and Judaism. All of them. Following the Crusades and the reconquest of Spain by Christian Spaniards, the leaders of Spain needed a way to unify the country into a strong nation. Ferdinand and Isabella, you've heard of them, bankrolling Chris, chose Catholicism to unite Spain, and in 1478 asked permission of the Pope to begin the Spanish Inquisition to purify the people of Spain. Now, limpieza de la raza, purification of the race. How are we going to do that? Although the Inquisition originally began to purify the nation from heretics, it came to have more materialistic racial and political motives instead of just purification, whatever that means. So heretics are also people that might be within your same religion but don't believe the same things that you do, or don't believe in the doctrine. Okay, so they began by driving out Jews, Protestants, and other non-believers. Most often we hear about this from the Jews, that is from the actions of the Spanish Inquisition. It's apparent it was an ethnic cleansing. The Spanish Inquisition and its actions caused 200,000 loyal but Jewish Spaniards to leave the country. So this graphic basically talks about torture. So waterboarding, definitely used here. This particular thing is basically suspension by the arms. So barely, you notice he's on tiptoes, and then he's also being burned. This is the wheel in which you're being bent backward and it essentially breaks your back. The word torque comes from Tomás de Torquemada, the Inquisitor General for Spain. He was responsible for establishing the rules of inquisitorial procedure and creating branches of the Inquisition in various cities. He remained the leader of the Spanish Inquisition for 15 years and believed responsible for the execution of around 2,000 Spaniards. One of the forms of torture, and this is where our word torque comes from, is twisting various limbs. Accused heretics were identified by the general population and brought before the tribunal. They were given a chance to confess their heresy against the Catholic Church and were also encouraged to indict other heretics. If they admitted their wrongs and turned in other aggressors against the Church, they were either released or sentenced to a prison penalty. If they would not admit their heresy or indict others, the accused were publicly introduced to in a large ceremony before they were publicly killed or sentenced to life in prison. So I want you to notice some of the features here. So, assuming intermarriage either voluntarily or through conquest or slavery, under Moorish conquest of the Iberian Peninsula, you had intermarriage between all these different groups. The ethnic responses to ethnic cleansing would be exile, let's leave the country, or conversion. The Jewish, Moorish, and Black Catholic conversos were targets of the Inquisition specifically, precisely because of their ethnicity. So, in Aramaic, the words for good and evil are metaphorically like ripe or unripe fruit. So even if you consider a heretic an enemy, the Aramaic scriptural view is that you allow God to ripen them. Torturing them is not going to ripen them. Let God do it. The first task of the Inquisition was inquiry. I'm just asking a question. Specifically, inquiry into the authenticity of the conversion of the Moors and Jews who had come under the sway of those particular monarchs. So they're questioning whether your religious conviction is real based on the color of your skin. The bloody reputation, though it existed for 3 centuries, is earned in the first 15 years, before the capture of Granada, which was the Moorish capital at the time. Because notice the Inquisition begins before the Moors are entirely expelled, still another 50 years away. 2,000 persons were burnt as heretics. Almost all of those who were executed were conversos, or new Christians, converts, that is, from Judaism, who were convicted of secretly practicing their former religion. Okay? We don't believe your... So, original position. In the law, in the psychology of law, original position is, what's the problem that the law is going to correct? Okay? So, if you take a biblical point of view, you don't forbid something that's not happening. Make sense? You forbid something that is happening, and that's going to happen with some predictable regularity, and you define it as a problem. So, the Inquisition, as a church court, had no jurisdiction over people in another religion, right? Makes sense. Okay? They're not technically Christians. But once you accept Christian baptism, they became capable of heresy in the technical sense of the word. Elegant trap, eh? We don't believe your conversion because we're going to kill you if you're not converted, but we don't believe your conversion is real because you're converting because you're scared. Not because you've actually accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. But given that they're heretics, being forced to become Christian under pain of death or loss of property, thus they were converting for the wrong reasons and subject to the Inquisition. So, nice circular logic. Nice original position there. Okay? This is not the practice of other branches of Christianity, notably the African and Asian churches in particular, but we'll leave that for the moment. So, the hierarchy of the Spanish church became concerned with reports of heresy of some of its new conversos. 1478, the time came that the true Christians had been waiting for. A young cavalier, so this is kind of like a knight figure, who was trying to court a Jewish girl, went to meet the girl and came upon a group of Jews and conversos in some mysterious celebration. The night was Jewish Passover, and the assembled had come together to celebrate it. So, true religion. And untrue, real and not real. So, true Christians are white in this particular framework. This is the first time, again, the meme of Christianity becomes racially exclusive. So despite there being African, Asian, and other sections of the church in the world, okay, here in this particular inquisitional framework, Christian means white. And that we suspect you because you have Moorish and Jewish blood. Since they don't have DNA testing, then this is going to be, I'm going to assume that this is a reference to race. Though I could be obsessed with that. But I'm just... So, Europeans then began defining their version of Christianity as the only legitimate version of Christianity, even though it is divorced from the influences and languages and countries of the birth of Christianity. So true Christians, white Christians, and we'll also see this replicated in the United States, too, with slavery. Slaves who were indentured servants, that is, European citizens, they can be beaten even though they're European citizens, but if they raise their hands to a Christian, I mean, this is in the law, you raise your hand to a Christian, you could be subject to further extension of your indenture. So a Christian is whites only? Where'd that idea come from? So, true red-blooded, real Americans, not like those people. So red-blooded actually is a meme that came from the Ku Klux Klan, talking about racial purity, meaning you are a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant with no trace of Italian or Jewish or any mixed mongrel race. So that term actually did come from the, well, when we get to this time period, I'll show you. But red-blooded, real American. Well, since all humans have red blood, what does that mean? So, under the Spanish Inquisition, the accused never knew who their accusers were. That's why in our jurisdiction, okay, you have the right to face your accuser. Once arrested, the accused heretics' property were seized. These properties were then administered at first by the crown and later by the general inquisitor. This fostered the means for anyone to accuse for personal reasons or to get gain. In many areas, men began to wonder if a man's worldly wealth, as well as his descent, had now become an incriminating circumstance. So anybody could accuse you without evidence. It didn't limit itself to punishing only those of the Jewish faith. This is especially true if the accused was found to have any Jewish blood in his ancestry. So part of this phrase is, as I said a couple of weeks ago, there were no European Jews before the 7th century. So 700 years at this point is probably, it's possible through intermarriage that you might erase some trace of non-European, i.e. non-white ancestry. But remember, at this time, Europe isn't wholly white. The colonial powers definitely weren't wholly white. But Jewish blood is a dark complexion because the original Jews were Africans of African descent. No European Jews before the 7th century. So even in Spain, Jews have been coming up into Europe for easily thousands of years. And even if the accused was now a devout Christian, he was tried as severely as possible because of their roots alone. And roots in this context equals skin color, because unless you live side by side, how would you know somebody's roots? For how long? So it had to be some easily detectable means, and again, since they didn't have DNA testing, how do they know? So the accused was not allowed to have a lawyer or counsel for his defense, and the names of all witnesses were kept secret. So you can see in our jurisprudence, you get to lawyer up. You get to face your accusers. You get to have evidence. All this is directly basic from the memory of the Inquisition. So during this time, and this is leading up to what is the discovery of America, so to speak. The original position, papal bulls, the Inquisition, and Christian discovery. So a papal bull, that is a proclamation issued by the Pope, has the force of law. So obviously, the Pope's a religious figure, so theoretically his proclamation should only pertain to Catholics. Right? And this was a position of the Inquisition. Well, if you're actually Jewish or Islamic, we got no power over you unless you convert on the threat of pain and death, and then we can question your faith. So it's papal bulls that started the Inquisition, and the doctrine of Christian discovery. Okay, so Christian discovery. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V gave King Alfonso of Portugal permission to capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to take all their possessions and property, and to put them in perpetual slavery. So, a Saracen is a person of African descent, dark-complected, Turkish, Islamic. Saracens and pagan. Declaration of war, essentially, against non-Christians and affect non-whites, even though there are non-white Christians in other places. So, under Christian law, infidels, heathens, and other enemies of Christ are to be treated as wild animals or beasts of prey, not even human. This is another condition of the papal bull. So, Colon, Cristobal Colon, his voyage across the Sea of Darkness, that is the Atlantic Ocean, was financed in part by the royal treasurers of the crusade. So, for example, Psalms 2:8, I shall give to thee the heathen for thine inheritance, and the uttermost parts of the earth for thy possession. So they took this as a direction to conquer the planet. So Cologne, that was Cologne's favorite passage in Psalms. So Cologne is Christopher Columbus. That's his anglicized name. Cristobal Colon. He shall have dominion from sea to sea, and from the river unto the ends of the earth. They that dwell in the wilderness shall bow before him, the Lord, and his enemies shall lick the dust. Yea, all kings shall fall down before him, all heathen nations shall serve him. So after Cologne's voyage, Pope Alexander VI in 1493 decrees severally, the Catholic faith and Christian religion will be everywhere increased and spread, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. Barbarian meaning the strange ones, or non-Christian. So, this is the first codification of Christian equal white European. So, 1493 and 1503, the Spanish Pope, the Portuguese Pope issued papal bills establishing the doctrine of discovery. That is, any Christian who, quote unquote, discovered lands that were not Christian, that are, for example, inhabited by indios, that is, indios is Spanish for in God, that is to say, those who were as God made them, that is, naked, dressed for the weather, or other savages could claim those lands for all of Christendom, forever. Okay, so when they say Columbus discovered America, that's not just, oh, well, he just was wandering around and, oh, found this land. No, the political implications in terms of real estate is once he planted the flag, this is Christian land now, and y'all have lost title to it forever, even if you convert to Christianity. Forever. This is also the legal principle by which the Russians, who never even made landfall in Alaska, did it from a ship, discovered Alaska, and then sold Alaska to the Americans without making landfall because they discovered it. Now, the Tlingit Haida nation, those of the totem poles, right, basically were a military power whose influence stretched from Alaska down into California, including, control of salmon streams, among other things. And they were a military power. You didn't mess with them. The Russians didn't even make landfall. and sold Alaska to the Americans on this principle. And, you know, when the Tlingit tried to basically go up against an American warship, they lost. And that's how we got Alaska. Even if those inhabitants later converted to Christianity, lost title to their ancestral homeland forever because of this. And there is if I might talk about this, but yeah, here we go. Yeah, Johnson v. McIntosh. So stare decisis is a legal term in Latin. That means you will be guided by the decisions of a previous legal authority. The papal bulls regarding discovery were used in the European colonization of Africa, the Americas, and Asia. But here in America, 1823, Johnson v. McIntosh, Tennessee, or actually it's not the Tennessee Supreme Court, it is the U.S. Supreme Court. Basically cites the papal bull as the authority granting land to one white man over the other because one had received his title through the Indians who actually had lost title to the land through discovery. And so this same, like I said, the same papal bull allowed the Russians to claim Alaska without ever making landfall. So the ruling, the Supreme Court justice who basically spoke for the majority said, well, the real moral thing to do, there is a moral question here, and the moral thing to do would be for all Europeans to leave and go back to Europe. But we're not going to do that. So the land goes to, I believe it was Johnson in this particular case, but yeah. So, in terms of the foundations of whiteness, you start with a mandate from God, and it helps if you help God write or edit the mandate. So, King James Version of the Bible, James gathered 12 white scholars who leave out about 200 books, especially those with African reference, changes biblical references like from tyrants to the more neutral kings, use Hebrew and Greek and but not Aramaic. The religious authority and the secular authority enforce God's will on earth, including various doctrines, including the doctrine of discovery. And then basically looking at issues of Christian supremacy, the ideas of blood or racial purity, superior influencing of Western civilization and Occidental versus Oriental, supremacy of West over East, and bringing the light to the unwashed masses. So, though to be sure, because of water shortages, bathing is not a European custom during this time, because of the, take this up on Wednesday. The outro music.